Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. I am excited to welcome you all to this important event where we'll be discussing the issue of convergence. That is, whether the economically weaker states are converging with economically well-off states in India. This convergence hypothesis is discussed with reference to public finances at the central and the state level. This topic is very much of relevance today as many states are struggling to step up their economic growth. We are fortunate to have some experts in the field with us who will share their insights. I, on behalf of CSEP, extend a warm welcome to Dr. Rajan Govil. Dr. Rajan Govil is Macroeconomic Advisor at IMF, South Asia Regional Training and Technical Assistance Center. He has earlier worked as Senior Economist at the IMF, Singapore Regional Training Institute, and in the IMF's Middle East and Central Asia Department. He has also worked as an economist, investment strategist in the private financial sector. He was Head of Investment Strategy Asia at BSI Bank and Chief Economist India at HSBC Bank. He has advised investment management firms on global asset allocation, economic opportunities, and assessing risk. Apart from this, he has also taught at Delhi University and Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. We welcome you, sir. Dr. Janak is a senior fellow and leads the macroeconomic segment in growth, finance, and development vertical here at CSEP. He has more than four decades of work experience, including in the Reserve Bank of India, the IMF, and Ministry of Finance. Dr. Raj served as an executive director in the Reserve Bank of India and as a member of its statutory monetary policy committee. At the IMF Washington, D.C., he was senior advisor to the executive director for Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, and Sri Lanka. He served as RBI nominee director on the governing board of the BSE and as a senior consultant in the Department of Financial Services, Ministry of Finance. Dr. Renu Kohli is an economist with research and practitioner experience on macroeconomic policies and issues. She has previously worked with the RBI, the IMF, and think tanks, including IGRIER and Institute of Economic Growth. Her work has focused on financial sector liberalization, capital flows, and exchange rate management in emerging markets with special India focus, international macroeconomic coordination, and recently the macroeconomic impact of decarbonization in India. Dr. Kohli has wider engagement with the private financial sector and investors through talks, presentations, and consultation on Indian macroeconomic policies. She also serves as an independent director on the board of NCML Limited and NFIN.
Good morning. Ashi, thank you for that introduction. And it's nice to be here at CSEP to present some work that I've done with Khyati. So thank you very much. Thanks, Janak and Renu, and thank you all for joining today. So first of all, this is a working paper, which is published by the IMF, and I'm working as the Macroeconomic Advisor at the IMF South Asia Regional Training and Technical Assistance Center here in Delhi. This is work done along with a co-author, Khyati Chauhan. She and I worked together at Singapore, and that's when we worked on this paper at that point in time. Just to set the background clearly that this is, the usual disclaimer. This represents the views of the authors and does not necessarily, these are not necessarily the views of the IMF. And I'd like to thank at the beginning colleagues at the IMF who gave their comments on this paper, and also the Indian authorities, Ministry of Finance and the RBI, who provided some very valuable insights. So let me proceed with what we are basically saying, and I'm happy to answer questions a little later. So, and I'll show a lot of these things on charts. So the first thing is that growth has, unlike what the literature says, is that growth across countries and across states over time is going to converge, or at least the per capita incomes. over time, and that has not happened in the Indian case, which we will see here. What we would think is that low-income states would grow faster because the marginal productivity of capital initially may be higher and so on. And this has not happened in India's case. In the last 20 years that we look at, from 2002 to 2023, we find that richer states or higher income states have grown faster than the lower income states, contrary to what theory would say. And that then leads us to, there would be multiple issues here, and we can't deal with everything. But one of the things that would matter is, given that the monetary policy, exchange rate policy across the states is all the same, the difference would be the fiscal resources from a policy perspective. And the other part would be structural reform at each individual state level, and of course, even at the national level. So really what we are focusing on here is what's happening with the public finances at the state level, and whether that can provide impetus for growth across the states. So when we look at the fiscal situation, most papers actually look at only the central government finances and the state government finances. What we wanted to get to is a picture of the public sector, which would include not only the central government, the state governments, but also the local governments or the municipalities and the public sector enterprises, both at the federal level, the central level, and the state levels. Unfortunately, data is a little difficult to get for the public sector enterprises as well as local finances. So we are looking only at the general government, which is the state and the center. And what we find, of course, is that the consolidated, especially in recent years because of COVID and so on, the consolidated fiscal situation has worsened. And why has it worsened? Because the public debt has gone up, the fiscal deficit has gone up, and partly because of COVID. But there are some signs that were visible even before COVID, especially at the state government level. And one of the things that sort of strikes us is that over the last 30 years, because combined states and the federal data, we start from fiscal year 1991, the revenue as a share of GDP has basically remained the same. It's basically been about 20% of GDP, which we believe is a challenge for India. And India, if it wants to progress, and if you want to go to become a developed country and so on, you would need resources. And so increase in revenues are important, both tax and non-tax. The other thing that we want to clear and dispel any doubts on this is that India is impacted by external events, and it's not only the external sector, i.e. the exports and imports, but the fiscal situation itself does get impacted. And this is important to bear in mind given the uncertainty in the global scenario, both in terms of tariffs that are being talked about by the incoming US government and other issues such as China's slowdown and so on. So all of these would impact potentially, if things go awry, they would impact our fiscal scenario, which, as I said, is already worsened, and it is, there is some fiscal space, but it's fairly limited. And an adverse event could, of course, impact macro stability because the government needs funds. And there are issues with public debt sustainability, which we don't discuss in detail over here. But if the real GDP growth were to go down, then the benefit that we have of the real growth rate being higher than the interest costs would sort of reduce. And that would mean that to ensure stability, you would need to run higher fiscals, or lower fiscal deficits, or lower your primary deficit. So that, of course, would mean you have to cut expenditure, which would not necessarily be very helpful at a time when the growth is slowing. So those are issues that are important and considerations that we need to keep in mind. States are very important, and we are not paying as much attention, I think, as we need to. I think Janak has done some work on states, which is good. So states, 60% of the expenditure, which is about 18% of our GDP, is the expenditure that the states are undertaking, and that's not insignificant. given that the total expenditure of the government sector is 30% of GDP, right? So, 18% of GDP is the state's expenditure. So the other issue over here is that the states, especially the low-income states, they don't seem to have enough resources on a per capita basis. And if we are saying that fiscal policy is the only policy apart from structural reforms that are available, because that's distinct for each state, then the resources available to the low-income states, such as Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, and so on, is much lower. And therefore, you may need some resources to be transferred to them, or greater resources to be transferred to them. And I know this is a political issue, so I'm not delving into that. But from an economic perspective, if you want to provide equal opportunity, you have to consider this. And as I said, we are excluding the local finances and PSUs. We are not talking as much about fiscal risks, off-budget expenditures, and guarantees, because one of the things we see is that while fiscal balances, fiscal deficits are there, but the public debt seems to be increasing faster. And that's something we need to look at in greater detail with numbers. So let me look at some of the charts here. Some of these may or may not be as clear to you. But the idea over here is, if maybe I'll move to the next chart because it's for all states. So we've divided the states into two elements, two parts. One is larger states that had a population of 20 million or more in fiscal 2002, and the others are smaller. And then within the large states, we have high income, low income, and middle income, which we again classified based on the per capita real GDP of each of these states. So if you look at the larger states over here, then you can see that, So this is the real per capita income into FY 2002, and on the y-axis we have the growth rate. So if you had a low per capita income, you would expect the growth to be higher, according to standard literature. And if the per capita income was higher, which is on the x-axis here, you would expect the growth rate to be lower, i.e. you would expect this trend line to be downward sloping. But what we find is upward sloping, and we see that some of these rich states, or most of these rich states, have grown faster, while the poorer states such as Bihar, Uttar Pradesh have not done as well. And the average growth in India's case is about 4.8%. The middle income states, which are in the purple, Madhya Pradesh, Assam, etc., are close to the trend line. It's only Odisha in the middle income group of states, which has grown by about 6%. And otherwise, it's some of these other states. Punjab is an outlier. Punjab, which has pretty much had the highest, along with Haryana, had pretty much the highest per capita GDP, has not grown at a fast enough pace. Sorry. Do you mind if I see you for a second? So clearly, as I said, this is not what you expect. This is not what you want. You want the lower income states to be growing fast as well. And this has implications both for balanced regional development and also has implications for overall economic growth going forward, right? So imagine and this is where a lot of the population resides, if Uttar Pradesh and Bihar are growing at a much faster pace, you can then expect the overall GDP growth to be much faster, right? So this is a challenge. Again, this is something which you all know, but just wanted to, just one of the things that the lower the per capita income, you'll see that those are the states which suffer from higher poverty, right? So poverty is, so you want these states to grow faster to reduce the poverty levels. Now, this is another thing that we do for the large states, is we try and look at what's happening to the high income states and the middle income states and low income states. And if this is, some of this is in acronyms, so it may be a little difficult, but here is basically the tax revenue, or the revenue side, and this is the expenditure side. So if you look at this, if you just look at the revenue non-development expenditure, which is essentially interest, pensions, and administration, which is sort of committed expenditures. And then you've got, grants to local bodies that the state governments make. And then you have revenue development expenditure, and then you have capital expenditure, which is about 2% of GDP. You can see that a lot of these revenue non-development expenditure and a part of these revenue development expenditures are met by the own resources of these states. Okay, so they're not as dependent on the government, on the central government. Here, on the case of the low-income states, their own revenues are pretty small, whereas, and this is just about enough to meet the non-development expenditures, which are committed expenditures. So they don't really have much left for development. Okay, even revenue development expenditure, forget about capital expenditure. So they are quite substantially dependent on central grants. And that's just something important to note, that these states therefore do not have as much fiscal space. Okay. Again, this is just to reiterate what I had said. The revenues have, which is the blue bar, has again been fairly stagnant at about 20%. And we saw an increase in expenditure around the COVID period, and which is why we saw the this purple line, which is the fiscal deficit, increase sharply. There's been some decline, but it still remains higher than what it was pre-COVID. And the expenditures again increase. And if you look at the public debt, the outstanding liabilities, they've been increasing since 2016-17, and we'll see a large chunk of that, large part of that is because of states, but then it just takes off during the COVID period, and before that also a little bit. So this is clearly worrying because public debt has reached levels that we haven't seen for almost 30 years, okay, which means that there is less fiscal space for the government to undertake other expenditures. I won't dwell on this, but I just wanted to show you that whenever there's an external event, for example, if we were to look at the Asian crisis in FY90, so and so, the buoyancy falls, which is basically reflecting that tax revenue growth doesn't keep pace. And again, we saw that in the 9/11 part. We see that in the global financial crisis, again in COVID. Okay. So clearly, the fiscal is also impacted, and substantially, I would say, by external events, and that's something to be cognizant of. So this is just the states' combined government finances. Again, by the way, a lot of these, all of these state finance data comes from the RBI, and the central government data comes from the budget documents. Here, you'll see the outstanding liabilities of the state start rising in FY15-16, and they've, they went close beyond 30% of GDP. They've come down a little bit, but the projection is still that they will continue to be in the 28% region. Okay, and given that the Fiscal Responsibility Act talked about 60% public sector debt, out of which 40% is central government, which implicitly implies that the state should be running at 20% public debt. This is much higher than that. Again, there's a variation here, but together, instead of 60%, we're about 80%. Most projections do not show any significant decline in this public debt level, which obviously has its costs in terms of interest and so on. So this is just a picture to show you, this is amongst large states and small states, just a picture to show you that some of the states, this is their own revenue, both tax and non-tax. So Odisha, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand are doing well, also because they're mineral rich, so they're getting non-tax revenue. Uttar Pradesh, it's in a descending order. So these are some of the states. The blue line is for fiscal year 23, and fiscal year 2002 is the red bar. So most states have seen an increase because the blue bar is higher as a share of their state's GDP. And then you've got some of the other states over here. Okay, so there's a bit of a decline, and West Bengal actually collects fairly low amounts of their own tax revenue. Okay, and this is the total revenue on the other chart, which just shows you the difference. So Bihar is collecting only 7-8%, of its own revenue. So basically, this the other part, 13-14%, is essentially the government's transfers. So you're already getting substantial transfers, but if you look at these pictures now, and I'll skip this in the interest of time. How much time do I have? 10 minutes or 5 minutes? Or? Okay, so I'm not doing well, so I'm worried. But here, capital expenditure per capita. If you see, that's the more important number. And you see, Bihar, West Bengal. Again, this is capital expenditure on the x-axis is what was there in fiscal year 2002, and this is what is there in 2023. So if the states that managed to be higher in both times, you would have an upwards sloping line. But this is downward sloping, which is in a sense is good because there's some convergence in per capita spending. But if you look at the states which are at the bottom, so you've got Bihar, West Bengal, Punjab, on a per capita basis, they're spending very low amounts on capital expenditure. Okay, and some of the states that were spending much less, like Odisha, are spending much more on a per capita basis. So they've done substantially well. Again, and this is for the lowest, the smaller states on the right, but let me skip that. But the idea over here is not to look only as a percentage of GSD or the gross state domestic product, but look in per capita terms. And if you look at this, then clearly there's a problem. And some of these states, if you look at them, Kerala, Bihar, Rajasthan, West Bengal, Punjab, Andhra Pradesh, these are not small states, okay? And they have a large population. So a lot needs to be done. Again, a similar story on some of these things, such as per capita expenditure in education, sports, and also I'll show you in the next chart, health. Some of the states have done well, some of the others have not done well. But if you look at the poorer states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, they're at the lower level on the y-axis here. This is fiscal year 2023, and they were earlier also low. Some of the states that were lower, like Odisha, has done well in particular. Chhattisgarh has also been able to increase expenditure quite a bit. And this is the situation on education side. Kerala still is high, Maharashtra is high, Assam has done well, but partly because of these fiscal transfers. Again, some of the states that are spending much more on medical and public health, you can see Uttar Pradesh is 900, Odisha is spending 3 times, so that's a huge difference. And some of the other states are lower. Punjab, again, interestingly, it was, it's on the right-hand, extreme right-hand side on the x-axis. That is what it was spending. So it was spending the highest on medical and public health in FY 2002, and now it's pretty much low, fairly low on a per capita basis. They're not spending as much. So this is the non-development expenditure, which is, as I said, committed expenditures, which is interest payment, pensions, and public administration. And you'll see some of the states, if as a share of the total expenditure, 45% of the total expenditures going into this expenditure, these expenditures for Kerala, for Punjab. Nagaland, Himachal, are smaller states. They have their own issues. Some of them used to be classified as there used to be a category, special category states, and Haryana, and so on and so forth. And if you go to the right-hand side, this is again as a share of total expenditure, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh are spending less. But there is a problem over here, because if Kerala, Punjab, or Haryana are spending a lot, especially close to 50%, then how will they have resources to spend on education or any other service that would help enhance growth? Again, this is the state's own revenue as a share of total expenditure. So if whatever they're spending, how much of it is being raised by themselves? And clearly, Gujarat, Haryana, Karnataka, some other states that are doing better than the other states. Now, this basically shows the state's financing of their total expenditure, and that, this just show, for example, in the case of Bihar, the gray bar is the share in central taxes, and then you have the grants, which is green, and then you have the fiscal deficit, which is the borrowing. So if you just look at the lower two bars, which is the blue and the orange bar, these are the state's own revenues, and that's very, very low, right? For Bihar, it does increase on a relative basis for Gujarat and Karnataka going to the right. They have to depend less on the central transfers or the share in taxes. Okay, so this is a challenge for some of the states. If you look at an all states basis, which is in the middle over there, then you can see that less than half is of the total expenditure is coming from their own revenues. And then you have the central transfers, both in the share of taxes as well as grants, and then you've got the fiscal deficit, okay, which is the yellow part. Okay, so again, this varies quite a bit. This is from an individual state perspective, outstanding liabilities, which is the debt and the fiscal deficit. So you can see, if you're looking at 20% as some sort of a benchmark, then there are only 3 states which have done well in maintaining a public debt is less than 20% and also fiscal deficit of less than 3%, which is basically Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Odisha. And this is clearly a problem as to how you manage these issues, because yes, it's okay to have a mandate that states can't go more than 3% of the fiscal deficit. But if you do that and you're spending a lot on non-development expenditure and other expenditures, you're going to be cutting down on capital expenditure. And almost half of the capital expenditure in the country is undertaken by states. Half in the country, I mean the central government and the state government. And if you look at the numbers for fiscal year 23, you see that the public sector expenditure on capital, which is, broadly also including public sector enterprises here, that remained fairly stagnant. It's only in the last 1 or 2 years, fiscals, that there's been an increase at the state level, but now that's going to come down. And because whatever you see on the central government's budget as showing higher capital expenditure, a lot of that is actually borrowings that companies such as NHAI used to do from the private market. Now they're doing it from the government. So from that perspective, the public sectors, the central public sector enterprises, their capital expenditure hasn't really gone up. So from an overall perspective, if we look at the central government, state government, and public sector enterprises, capital expenditure has gone up a little bit in fiscal year 24, mainly the states. Part of it is because central government borrowed funds and then they lent it to the state governments. But this is a challenge. Capital expenditure really hasn't increased that much. And in the case of fiscal consolidation, given this situation, you have very little what I would call fiscal space to expand capital expenditure, which of course then means that growth is going to be impacted. This is just the same thing with primary deficit. So just to conclude, fiscal policy and structural reforms at national level are very important, very key, because from a policy perspective, you can't really do much across the states in terms of monetary and exchange rate policy. For growth, what you need is labor, capital, and total factor productivity. And total factor productivity, according to endogenous growth, critically depends on your institutions and spending on R&D. So research and development spending is very, very low. Even at the state level, it's less than 0.1% of GDP. Overall, for the economy, it's about 0.7% of GDP. And you compare it with the developed world, the US spends almost 6-7% of GDP. China is spending 3-4% of GDP. OECD spends much more. And if you're not going to be able to innovate and spend on R&D, innovate, and also be unable to increase investments, then clearly, you're going to mark down your potential GDP growth. If you think it's 7%, 7.5%, but if you're not spending on either of these, it'll eventually come down. And that's a cause for concern for macro stability in terms of debt sustainability, in terms of what it does to the balance of payments, in terms of what it does to the monetary accounts, the monetary system, and so on and so forth. So transfer of resources from our perspective to low-income states is very important still. Again, you have to broaden the tax base and improve tax administration to try and get more taxes. One of the things that for us from an economic perspective is very critical is the administered pricing mechanism, which is creating issues. And we take a few examples, such as in the agricultural sector. You have minimum support prices, you have free electricity, free water, and so on, and which does help agriculture, has helped, but you have, these resources are fungible. So if you're going to be spending only on agriculture, which is not necessarily a high productivity activity, then you are not able to spend on other things. And it creates other problems. For example, I think it was raised, I think by Montec and others, that in one of these seminars here, that at the rate at which water is being depleted because of the subsidies being given to rice and wheat, Punjab will probably become a desert at some point in time, right? And the problem with all of this is that the resources are not going into where they need to. Again, the issue of cross-subsidization with the railways charging higher for freight, or electricity rates being higher for manufacturing units, obviously makes them uncompetitive globally. So the administered, and I could go on. I mean, in terms of monetary policy, for example, there's a recent RBI paper which says that potatoes, onions, and one more, tomato, onions, and potatoes, right? That has been driving inflation, right? And one of the things that one could argue also is that these subsidies, negate the reason for farmers to be growing these products, right? And therefore, if that is the case, is this subsidy policy actually undermining running the monetary policy, right? In some senses, and there are other issues with it. So subsidies are about 3.6% of GDP, 2.1% for the central government, and about 1.5% according to the RBI at the state government level, of which almost 0.8% is going for electricity, which is a very large sum. Again, Punjab and Odisha, you've seen a contrast in terms of spendings, in terms of, Odisha has been able to do well. They've also been able to control their fiscal deficit and their public debt. And what that has meant is that if your public debt is coming down, your interest costs are coming down, and that reduces your fiscal deficit, which has provided more fiscal space for Odisha. So you need to reorient expenditure towards your state and national priorities, which is essentially growth is very important. And again, just to reiterate, a tailored approach is necessary because each state is different. And for each state, it's the fiscal policy and the structural reforms that are going to matter. Okay. So let me stop here. Thank you very much. Good. So I just beat you to it. More stable. Sorry, you want to come? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for the presentation and the paper. And sorry about the mix-up earlier. I got the program wrong. So yeah, to resume what I had started with, which is the drivers of convergence, which is that there's a discussion in the beginning and about capital assuming perfect mobility, because we're talking about, one open economy within states, and capital mobility, labor mobile, and technology is given. And so therefore, ultimately, the driver of convergence that you are focusing upon is capital, and within that, the public component and not the physical one, right? And the link is, I think that the link needs to be made clearer over there. It needs to be, or let me put it this way, it needs to be clearly spelled out. And this is one of my major comments. I have just two major comments and some minor ones. So, growth is predicated heavily upon public investment and capex, and it's similar at the central level. But now, the argument is that the debt situation is stressing it out, and therefore that will impinge upon growth, and therefore in turn that is going to reduce convergence, right? Or slow down convergence, assuming that the high growing states or the less debt distressed states will continue to maintain their capex, public capital expenditure, and continue to grow faster, and therefore widening the income gap, perhaps. We don't know. So, because the only channel that is considered is that of public investment, it would be useful if there was some bit of empirical evidence in this regard that you could offer to draw the link between the first part of the paper, which is growth convergence, and the second part of it is the fiscal situation. So that would be very interesting, all India or at another levels, because if we just look at 10 years or at least 11 or 12 years, starting from 2013, 14 onwards to now, which is more than half the period or roughly half the period that of your study, 02 to 23, then it's actually just public capex which has been supporting growth. Physical investment has been in decline. So, the fact that that is happening at both levels, center as well as states, it would be really meaningful to have that. Another suggestion in that context would be actually to just look at history, have a temporal kind of comparison, which is, you mentioned in the paper that 1961 to 91, the 3 decades, there was evidence of convergence, right? And then thereafter the period is it's reversed. So why? So the drivers would be very important, especially because migration, I think, which is labor mobility, has picked up notably, as we know, and these low income states and also the debt distress are one of the biggest exporters of labor. So why is it? Is it because decreasing returns to physical capital or the private component of it in other states hasn't pushed out investment from the high investment and the high income states to the lower ones or whatever? So I think a temporal comparison or at least some kind of analysis there would be useful. Along with cross-country evidence, because we do find that, for other countries, the convergence doesn't reverse this way. So, some bit of, I think, strengthening of the fortification on this regard would draw the links very more clearly with the fiscal aspect, or which is, so, coming down to, I think that's historical instances would be very useful. I think I've covered that. The second major comment that I have is that of the distinction that are drawn between one state, which is Orissa, and the second one, say, Punjab. Now, there is a mention about the fact that it is a mineral-rich state. And but I think again a discussion about how aggregate shocks which impact the entire economy, but they have differential effects across the states. That's a very important point, because your period is also picking up a huge resurgence in commodity prices. From 03 as the global commodity cycle picked up, 01 actually, 01, 02, all the way to the global financial crisis, and thereafter there is a big drop, and then it picked up again from 2016, 17 onwards. So Orissa has benefited enormously from that. It is, to the best of my knowledge, the largest producer of iron ore, much more than Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, etc. So, you have actually differences which are spatial. That is, why not Jharkhand, why not Chhattisgarh, and why Orissa, right? And then you have over time as well. So these shocks must be controlled for, but you're not really regressing convergence in that way. But if you find a way, I think that would strengthen your paper enormously. So that's the other major comment I have. Of course, to return back to my first one, which is that the other channels, which is migration, at least I think there is some bit of evidence that migration and then the remittances, they do play a role in pushing up and supplementing the incomes of these states, because the remittances are very large interstate. They do show up when consumption goes down. Whenever there is a cyclical slowdown or even a structural one in India, it's actually the rural to urban migration that goes down. And with that, the remittances pull down. And overall, we see it that there is a demand pull down and aggregate demand on the consumption side. So the evidence on that in the aggregate sense is there. So it might be useful for you to look at that. I think, again, diffusion is important, technology, because, and if I just relate it to your conclusion on R&D and all, I would just actually just say, argue back saying that when most of the states are not producing anything, no goods are being produced, or less investments actually across India, all India level, at the national level, investment is declined. I mean, R&D technology is given. They're far distant, very distant from the global technology frontier, as it were. So I would say technology is given. And technology is given, and India's really way very much lower from the global technology frontier. So R&D spending, yes, linked to specific products, innovation makes sense. Any firm which is a very large exporter or has a good, export market would be innovating and would be logically should be spending in R&D. But as a general prescription, I have my doubts about that. But of course. Now, the third one is the link between convergence and all, because the grants and transfers from the center to the states. The three of the states have been the largest recipients. I think UP, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, and one more. Anyway, so I just did not note it down. It's there. Yeah, Assam. So they've been largest. So that's another counterfactual that you can use. Because if your argument is predicated upon the fact that it is the only driver of convergence that you're considering, then the respective transfers, why is it that the bang for the buck is not being seen? So, there are differences even amongst the low income states as far as the transfers are concerned. So, relative to that, these states ought to be showing some degree of, increase in per capita incomes. So, that would also be a useful counter check as to, how strong the argument about grants and etc. is in driving convergence. Is it that migration is failing to equalize? Is it that the grants are failing to equalize the income gap or close the income gap? And what about technology dispersion? So these are the questions that I had. I have some minor comments as well before I close. On this central sector schemes and centrally sponsored schemes. By and large, these schemes are pretty much geared towards certain regions, specifically states like, say, the Northeast, and then specific groups, social groups, like, say, other backward classes, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes. They are not really oriented towards states. So in that sense, how these the funds allocated towards these schemes, where and how the incidence of those incidence of that spending by the center and matching. So that's why they go unutilized as well, very often by the states. So, what is the incidence, and is it disproportionate in some cases simply because it's given across groups, social groups? And that's why India's welfare policy and all those schemes, including that of financial inclusion, all the way back from the 60s have always geared towards groups and rather than, say, classes. So that's one minor point. The second is that the fund definition of the fiscal deficit that you use, I agree with that totally. Disinvestment should not be, it's a one-off item and it doesn't lead to anything. But, as you're saying that the data matches very closely corresponds to the handbook of the RBI's thing. I found that actually in FY 22 and 23, or 21, 22 is very large. It's as much as a percentage point. Now that's a small, not so small thing. So where it is coming from, one way is to just see how much of the difference is explained by the assets, which are classified as financing item in the authority's classification vis-a-vis that of the fund classification, which is not treated as a financing item. That's second point. So table 2, I think it is. Now, credit to GDP, I think that as an indicator, yes, I agree that it is both investment and consumption would be low. So credit GDP, because it's also a function of income after all. So it would be low. So I'm not sure how good an indicator that might be. I have some things to say on this tax buoyancy. Of course, it is not central, but because you mentioned it, you might want to, you do mention that there are some changes in tax rates and there are changes in coverage that are there. But if you see in the last 16 onwards, the number of additional revenue measures, ARMs, are enormous. They abound. And that at the central level, at, specifically, I can mention, other than the tinkering with rates, etc., I can mention the one-time, the so-called amnesty schemes. We had Vivad Se Vishwas. There was first one, which was the voluntary disclosure income scheme, VDIS. Then that went into a second edition. Then it became Vivad Se Vishwas Tak 2. It was very popular. And at times, in 1 year, if I remember correctly, I think the amount fetched in terms of direct revenues was as exceeding 500 billion rupees, some 536 or something. Now that's not a small amount, right? In percentage of total direct income tax revenues. So, this, if you adjust for that, the RBI did one exercise, I think in FY17, and you would find it I'll send you the reference, either in the bulletin or see. So they adjusted it, and they also took out the fuel taxes, right? When the commodity prices, oil prices collapsed in 2017, I mean, they went all the way to something like $40, or average, was for a year was like something like $30 to $40 a barrel, which was very different from something like 100 in 2012. So that was an enormous windfall, but it was one time, something like 3 trillion. So if you adjust for that, then the buoyancy would go down. I'm not saying you do it, but if you would mention it, it would be a very useful argument to the paper. And I can shamelessly, plug my own work on this. I have a paper on tax buoyancy. It's a CSEP working paper, and I have actually all the measures. So it's an easy reference for you. Okay. I think that's about does it all, maybe. Yeah. So, there's one question I had which I missed in the across the state comparison, which is that the capex has increased from what I could make out from your discussion for all the low income states except West Bengal. So, but then Bihar and UP, there's a sharp increase in capex. So why has the gap begun to close? So it's another, I mean, just there are things which are there in the paper, but if you could link it to the first part of it, which is convergence, that would be very useful. Right now, I find that the two are good. And then the converse also, that the per capita income growth could have even been slower had this not happened. I mean, that's also always true. So, okay, that's it. Thank you very much. How much time? Okay. Not doing so badly.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Rajan, for this
Thank you.
wonderful presentation. And this issue of convergence is not new. It has been widely debated in economic literature, particularly growth literature, from the mid 1950s when the Solo-Swan model came, and which you have also referred in your paper. And so in that context, we are all wondering why poor countries are not able to converge with rich countries. And the states are that in many countries also this discussion has percolated down to the regional or states level as to why various regions are not able to converge. I mean, the economically poor regions or states are not able to converge to economically richer or economically well-off states or regions. So in that context, very important study, and I would like to compliment to you and your co-author.
Thank you.
And so let me now come to the key points. Why convergence? Why do we expect convergence? As you have mentioned in your paper, this basically, originates from the Solo-Swan model, the new classical growth theory. And the main reason for that was the diminishing margin returns of capital. They argued that if you have more capital, that it will have diminishing margin returns. And since as you accumulate more capital, you will have diminishing returns, and the states or countries which have low level of capital, will be able to grow faster, and as a result, you will converge. And that was the idea. By the way, Solo-Swan model had recognized the importance of technological progress, but they said it is exogenous. So that was the key thing in their paper. And they said it's basically, technological progress takes place as a way of scientific process, and it is independent of economic forces. And they said in that context, the entire growth process is exogenous and it doesn't depend on economic forces. But what we observed that over the period of time, different countries, the rich countries continue to grow and poor countries continue to lag, and there was absolutely no signs of convergence. And this model, of course, was challenged in the mid-80s by various authors, particularly Endogenous. These are all called Endogenous growth models. And the key reason for this, for note convergence, what they said was because for human capital. They said that the process is not exogenous, it is endogenous. Because when you work on various economic activities, in the process you produce, you invent new products, you invent new processes and new markets. So it's not outside the system, it is within the system. And how innovations take place, as you yourself mentioned, it comes because of research, expenditure on research and development, and where the role of education also comes. And in their model, it was human capital. So convergence, according to the endogenous growth models, cannot happen if the human capital continues to be, that level continues to be very different. So let me show you some data in the case of, and you, of course, before I come to data, I will also like to mention that you said that capital, labor, and technological progress, they are mobile. But the fact of matter is that they are very different in different states. And let me show you some data. Can you upload the presentation? Which it's there. Okay. See, this is the Human Development Index. And you can see Bihar is at the bottom and Kerala is on the top. And though the difference between the two values looks very small, but it takes years. It is a very slow moving process. It takes years to, catch up. So if you have this much differences in Human Development Index, there is no way convergence can take place. So Bihar cannot catch up with richer states if it has lower level of human development. So we also conducted some study. Let me show you some more slides. As you found, we also found that there was no convergence among states. Different states had different, level of per capita income. And it should be downward sloping, but it's not downward sloping, it's upward sloping, which shows there is divergence. In fact, forget about convergence. It's not even flat line. It's basically states are diverging in their growth pattern. But next slide is more interesting. You see panel A, so we split the states into two categories, low income and high income. So if you see the high income states, we did find some convergence. You see panel A, and we also found that some convergence in low income states. See panel B. Okay, but more revealing is the panel C and panel D. And we further, bifurcated the states in the low income category based on low level of HD and low level of and high level of HD. Okay, you see panel C, low income, low HD states. You see there is very small convergence. It's almost negligible. But you see the panel D, there is huge convergence taking place. It's downward sloping. So the clear message which emerges from this slide is that there cannot be convergence if the levels of human development are different. So if you expect, there is need for convergence, then we need to achieve similar level of human development. So now let me come to the role of fiscal policy in you make a very clear distinction that the fiscal policy is distinct. I'm not really able to figure out that from the study. Why? So fiscal policy is basically a demand management tool like monetary policy. But of course, it has some other elements which monetary policy doesn't have, which makes it a little different. But what are those aspects? There are a lot of data in your study, very useful data. But I'm not able to clearly establish from those data as to what are the critical elements of those fiscal policy. What are those elements of fiscal policy which clearly led to, which could have led to convergence, particularly which could have led to higher growth of low income states. You have, when you made the presentation, you talked about innovation and RD and capital expenditure. And some states, of course, are fiscally constrained because very high debt to GDP ratio. But if we talk about that fiscal policy has a distinct role to play, I think we need to establish as to what are the elements of fiscal policy which will make poor states, grow faster than other states. I really didn't find that kind of analysis. And so I have two suggestions. One, I think what we can do is, it's flowing from my previous remark. If we really want to examine the role of fiscal policy as a distinct from other policies for convergence, then we clearly need to establish like which element of fiscal policy can help poor states grow faster than others. Number two, you also talked about the transfer of resources from the center to states. If you see the formula which is adopted by the Finance Commission, 45% weight is given to distance from the income. As Renu was also mentioning, some of the poor states are getting, large resources from the, center under the Finance Commission recommendation. And many rich states, particularly Tamil Nadu, has been complaining a lot. Like, this has been going on for many years, 30, 40 years, more than that. And how long you will continue to compensate, that those poor states, if you are not able to show whether those large transfers have made any difference to their, well-being or their economic growth. So I think in this context, it will be very important to know the resources which are being transferred from the center to states, for what purpose they are being used. Are they being used only for revenue expenditure, in which case it will have no impact on long-term impact on growth? But in case if they're being used more for capital and human development expenditure, in that case it can make difference. So I will stop here. But my key point which emerges from this study, if we want that convergence to happen, I think we need to focus more on capital expenditure and human development. Unless we are able to establish that through fiscal policy, I think we will not be able to clearly indicate that the fiscal policy has a distinct role to play. I'll stop here. Thank you very much. By the way, I enjoyed reading your paper. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Renu and Janak. So should I?
I want to ask
sure.
you, how would you prefer? You want to just take a few
Maybe
minutes to
I'll-
respond to this, and then we can open the floor for discussion.
Sure.
Okay.
So
Carry on.
let me just stay here then, because I need my water, which is a bit of a problem there. So let me start with Janak and also Renu in a sense. Let me just give you a broad picture as to why, when we did the study, what is the motivation behind it. So the motivation behind the study was essentially to look at what is happening to the fiscal situation over the last 20, 30 years and what is happening statewide and what is happening from a consolidated picture. And then we wanted to look at what the parameters are across the states from, in terms of growth and so on. So that, that was and to get a broad picture. So the first, let me come to what you said on human capital and so on, and I completely agree with that. So there's no question, and which is what our paper is also saying, that we need to free up these resources. And one of the things that we did look at is, for example, education outlays and so on a per capita basis. So clearly, what you are saying is absolutely correct. Now, but before that, if you just step back a minute, so what are the policy options for the government, right? Which is what we are looking at. So the policy options are monetary policy, exchange rate policy, fiscal policy, and structural reforms. So now, when we are looking at across the states, so what we want to look at is, because at an individual state, nothing can really matter, but fiscal policy does. And so we try to relate what is the differences potentially in fiscal policy. And by the way, this is work in progress. So there's a lot more that needs to be done. The other thing that we have a problem with is we don't have investment data for each state.
Absolutely.
So that creates problems of running any regressions or doing anything meaningful. So So what we find is that as you point out in some of the states, the high capital, and so we don't go deeper into looking at education variables and so on, which one could. So we just try to capture that through one element, which is Human Development Index, and we show that. So the idea over here is that whatever expenditures you're making, you want to focus more on things that will give you growth. Which is education is extremely important, and then capital, and then also research and development. Now, research and development, again, just going back to what you said, is important from our perspective because every state has different needs. Every state may, for example, and there is some expenditure going on agricultural research, but the soil, the climate, everything is different. How the climate change is happening. Are the states spending something which may be relevant for them? Right? It's not about everybody trying to develop an EV vehicle. It's about each state's issues and where those money should be spent. And when I say it's an R&D, it doesn't mean necessarily always science. It could be, other things as well, which may be relevant, logistics or whatever, each state. So human development is important. Now, again, fiscal resources, when I look across states, and I haven't shown that here, for example, electricity subsidies are very different for different states. Rajasthan may be spending much more than other people. So the argument over here is if fiscal policy is the only option that I have, then you want to move your expenditures away from subsidies to education, for example, right? So that I think is I think we are sort of on the same plane. And again, going back to this point, one of the things that we notice is non-tax revenue has been on a declining part for the states. For the center also it's been, but it's been mitigated to a large extent by RBI transfers. Okay, so if you look at it last year, I think, or the year, almost of the 20% revenue that the government is getting on a consolidated basis, 1% of GDP is coming from RBI transfers, which is huge, okay, which is a challenge in itself. But that's something we don't refer to in the paper. So if the states are not collecting enough non-tax revenue, which is electricity charges or education charges or whatever, and that's been declining, then clearly they don't have enough resources to spend. Right. And when I say spend, it doesn't have to be capital. It could just be maintenance, right? Do our schools have proper classrooms with a fan? Do they have a laboratory? Right? Do they have a library? I mean, these are questions that we need to ask ourselves. And these are, this is clearly going to have a challenge in terms of the human development indicator and our growth. So that's where we, I was coming to. So those are the elements in terms of the expenditures that we want to focus more on, rather than the old pension scheme or the new pension scheme, right? So on the transfers, yes, it's an issue. It's a political issue, so I'm not going to comment on it. But again, it's a statistical problem, which is I am looking only at numbers in terms of monies, but we really need to look at outcomes, and we don't really have data on outcomes. And until we get a sense of that, so measuring investments, measuring outcomes, then how do I know? Even if, as I said, that maybe it requires more transfers. By the way, that is not the only thing I'm saying. I'm saying that states need to raise their own resources as well, but there may be a need for additional transfers. So again, this goes back to collecting this right statistics and then making policy. Right. So that I definitely take on board. That yes, you may be transferring, but that just shows up with higher money. But does it actually show up with outcomes? Again, coming back to some of the issues, because there are a lot of them, so I hope I answered some of them and all of them. And if I don't, please
you have
to ask
5 minutes to do that.
5 minutes is a lot of time.
Okay. Then I'll scale it down because we are spilling over.
We are?
Yes. We must end by 12:25, maybe just like a few more minutes. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just take a couple minutes. I think I've answered some of these issues, but one of the issues that we have is the data availability on investments.
Yeah, physical capital, of course, I understand that.
Migration, I don't know if we have data going back across states.
There is migration data, and I think what the indicator that is being used is I think train travel,
Okay, so
etc.
maybe
So,
I-
boarding from there and
I'll take
probably
some.
the railways, God knows where it is, but that's there.
Okay.
And, if I may add, I mean, migration is a huge driver because
No,
because it's also a channel through for diffusion
No, of
of
course.
know-how and spillovers and education. Okay.
Yes, I mean,
can get back
to
to
some
it.
extent, yes. Yes, Odisha and Odisha has definitely benefited from other non-tax revenues, particularly minerals. But again, it goes back to why are other states not collecting other, other fees and so on. They may not be able to collect as much as Odisha. But Odisha and Punjab is just shown as a contrast. I'm not saying that those are the only two states I'm talking about. It's just because I want to keep the paper short because nobody wants to read it anyway. So it's better to just focus on a few. But if you look across the states, you'll find some similarities and some dissimilarities. The point I'm trying to make is that Odisha has used its resources, on a fiscal perspective. If you look at Odisha, they've created a contingency fund to take care of natural calamities. They have a framework for fiscal risk that they publish every year.
That was 1990, the
No,
cyclone.
it's there. No,
The cyclone, 10,000 people died. So
Yeah,
there were
but
political costs to it. So that's why it happened.
No, but it happens also in other states, right? But to a lesser extent. But the point is that they did it. There are a lot of things that happen in states, but states don't take action. There's pollution in Delhi. But what is happening really is not very clear to me, right? So those are, but they've made an effort, and they do publish a fiscal risk report every year. We have to give it to them for that. So they have done something. Central sponsor schemes, yes. Again, I don't know the details, and again, the intent of the paper was not to delve into those details. On buoyancy, I take your point that there are additional resource mobilization measures that are taken up, and that is something we don't capture. But from our perspective, is only to show that there are changes, and one of the things that we do want to show is that the fiscal does get impacted by external events, and that's very critical to understand and keep in mind. So if there are adverse external events, given the precarious fiscal situation we are in, we could have some challenges. So let me stop here, and thank you very much for your comments.
So, okay, we have about 10-15 minutes for discussion, so we can take questions. You want to collect them 1, 2, 3, or depending on thing, or you want to respond as you go along?
Yes.
Whatever works.
Yes, my basic question is that
Yes.
we are finding that I mean
Please introduce yourself and then.
yes, I am Manish
and keep
Sharma.
the-
I am
keep
Manish
the
Sharma.
question
My
short,
basic question
please.
is that we are finding that central government is having certain kind of policies, that promote, innovations as far as chips are concerned, as far as, for example, plane manufacturing, where I mean, tie-ups with Tata are concerned, their partnership with US on ISET, which promote, I mean, these type of manufacturing, on wafer designing, I mean, innovations, etc., for these chips, in certain states, for example, in Hyderabad, Gujarat, in Tamil Nadu. So how is that impacting, as far as inequity in states is concerned? And my second question is regarding, we are also finding that there's also, I mean, as far as states are concerned, we are finding that climate risks are also, creating havoc, as far as agriculture production is concerned, and there are central policies for ethanol also. So which is also impacting, the income of farmers, etc. So how do you see that kind of, risk going forward and inequity, aggravating? Thank you.
We take another? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, mine boils down to like what Janak sir pointed out earlier, but I'm thinking more from sir the philosophy of convergence that's being discussed. I was just trying to think the bigger picture behind that. I mean, the bigger picture behind that is so that the how can the states get more coffer like in money at the end of the day, reduce the fiscal this thing. I mean, or the transfers. How can they reduce the transfers? I'm just trying to think why is even China. If you look at the China's case, the provinces that are rich, they have continued to become richer, and the growth rates in the richer provinces itself have increased as the China has continued to grow. So this whole divergence or the convergence philosophy, is that the appropriate philosophy itself? Can we think of something else beyond this?
Okay. So
Next.
there is one more question at the back, and then
Hi, Krishna Vora, ORF. I have a question. I'd like to revisit one of the points that was touched upon, particularly on Orissa and iron ore production. So I would love if you could elaborate a little more on how recent declines in iron ore production in Orissa and Karnataka and other of the largest producers, how will that impact industries like steel making, particularly in terms of how India says it's moving in a direction towards sustainable steel making and relying less on iron ore, though it is already fiscally impacting states and the country at large. So I did want to know what your thoughts on that. How do you think this would impact the state economies and the Indian economy at large in terms of the steel industry and other industries?
There's another one here.
Yeah, one second.
Okay.
Before, I'm not sure if was that question for me or for Renu or generally about iron ore?
Probably for you.
Okay, I will try and answer that to the best of my ability.
Okay.
Open question.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Please.
I'm Vijay Kumar. I teach in Delhi University. My question is whether there is any, what is the crowding, whether there is a crowding effect or crowding in effect of the public expenditure when you look at the across states and at the national level. I'm very curious to know what effect public expenditure has, whether it's crowding in and crowding in out in the last 50 years across states and over the period of time. There.
Okay. So maybe I'll just start with the first
Yeah,
question and then
yeah.
we'll just
Take
go on.
another
So
round later
on the question of chips and other industry, I take it that your question is that it's been implemented, these are factories or whatever being set up in certain states which are already rich. And what does it mean for, yes, I mean, this is clearly if it's going to be only in certain richer states and for whatever reasons, then it is going to increase inequality or growth. By the way, we're talking about, yeah, so that's the first thing. And the second part was climate risk. Yes, that's very important. And this is a major challenge. So one of the things that the IMF did point out last year in its staff report was that if you want to spend money on mitigation of climate risk, then the public debt would go substantially higher in the next 20, 30 years. So this is a challenge both for the state government and the federal government. And to that extent, it is important that you have some fiscal risks and some other mitigation methods like Odisha has done. And I think there is some impetus to that being, implemented or being tried out in other states. So yes, absolutely, take your points on that. On philosophy of convergence, I think, again, you need growth across the board. You need development across the board. And when I'm talking about convergence, it's income is important, but and it may not be absolutely equal. But ultimately, you want to provide the similar opportunities to Indian citizens across the board, right? And if certain states don't have those kind of resources, then clearly you are creating that inequality and you are exacerbating it. And that's really where we come, like Janak mentioned, human development is very important, right? So if you want schools or proper schooling, then it's important if you want to talk about a demographic dividend being utilized, it becomes even more important. So that's essentially the context. Now, of course, some states, it's not that UP and Bihar are not growing. They're still growing at 5% and the others are growing at a faster pace. But those opportunities, because if the growth is higher, the revenue collections are higher and the spending therefore can be higher on a per capita basis. And that's really what I'm talking about. On iron ore and steel, yes, if the commodity prices do come down, then clearly that's going to impact the revenue. And one hopes, therefore, that these kind of fiscal risks are accounted for. And there are some risk mitigation methods put in place, right? Either there's a fund or whatever when you're in better times. But undoubtedly, this will create problems, right? But so this is specific to Odisha and Karnataka or whoever is, a commodity exporter or Jharkhand or whatever. But I think the broader point is also on non-tax revenue. The non-tax revenues across the states have fallen. And if you exclude the RBI transfers, then even for the central government, the non-tax revenue has declined. And that one has to see why that is so, because this again goes back to the entire point that we are trying to make on administered pricing, right? So if you have administered pricing and these prices are out of whack, you're basically ensuring that you have misallocation of resources. So, and you know it basically straight from minimum prices and maximum prices. You fix them, you'll never have an equilibrium, which is the first best case. So that is the thing. Crowding out I don't know if there are studies. We don't look at it at this point in this particular paper. But our perspective is that if you want to have equal opportunities or some equality, then clearly one has to give some thought to it from a fiscal perspective. And whether building the roads is better than not having the roads, I would opt for the former. Again, if we talk about capital expenditure, I think just talking about capital expenditure is not important. Not important. It is important, but even expenditures on operations and maintenance are very critical. So if you're not going to be able to, you just build the bridge, but you don't maintain it, or you build a building and don't maintain it, then that's also a big challenge. And for all of these, you need resources. So, if you look at the state of the public buildings, especially at the state government level and local government level, it's not, I don't know. I've taught in Delhi University as well. I'm sure lots of things can be done to improve the condition of the buildings and the lecture rooms and so on that we teach in.
No, just
So
to
that's
supplement,
sorry.
no.
Yeah,
But
please.
in general, capital expenditure does crowd, and we did find it. There's some study in the Reserve Bank. So capital expenditure crowds in private expenditure, but revenue expenditure, I'm not too sure. But absolutely, there is enough evidence to suggest that if the central government spends more on physical capital, it helps private sector more investment. Yeah.
Then why should we worry about fiscal deficit?
No, fiscal deficit, we worry for different reasons. You see, your finances are constrained. If you have more fiscal deficit, the issue is that first of all, you have more debt on which you have to pay more interest. So you are left with fewer resources, lesser resources for other things. And then, you are also now open to, in other world. And, if they feel by fiscal deficit, you will either inflate your economy, okay, or you will, there will be some problem. Then capital outflows take place, which creates their own problem. So fiscal deficit is a big major problem, but the limited point within the fiscal deficit, whatever you have to have it, you need to spend more on capital expenditure and less on, you need to spend more on capital goods or capital physical infrastructure, I mean to say, and less on other things as far as possible. Yeah.
Sir, on the question of increasing transfer central resources to states, to poorer states, it's already a very contentious topic with certain states and slightly richer states objecting tax revenue transfers to not so rich states. So what do you suggest is the way to increase those transfers? Do you suggest that we go beyond the 42% limit? Or do you suggest that we invest more through these CSS schemes, which are then said to be very having a very central control and states are not given so much power as to where to spend? Or do you think then we should focus on the quality of the expenditure, as Janak sir pointed out, that we should be generally spending more on health and education, but then how to go about it, how to ensure, do we place more soft targets? But then there is also an issue with that it's hampering the process of decentralization. So how to navigate through this?
Well, this is obviously a very extremely difficult question, but I will respond to it. But are there any other questions?
There's one here.
Yeah, please.
I think
Yeah,
we'll make
please.
this the last one.
Hi, I'm Shrishti from PRS. So I had a general trend that has been noticed in the last couple of years is that a lot more and more states are slipping into revenue deficit, and states like Maharashtra, which hadn't incurred revenue deficit lately, has also slipped into revenue deficit. And of course, it's a serious concern for the economy of states. So how do you see us navigating this in the next couple of years? Because it is quite a serious concern for states. I think 13 states are now incurring a revenue deficit. So how do you look at this issue as for the country's economy and states' economy? you.
Thanks very much for those two very
Okay,
interesting.
there's
and
one
important-
last one.
Oh,
We
please.
cannot deny
No,
Aarti.
please, yes, please. go ahead.
She was the commencement of the program.
Thank you. So I was wondering, do power dependencies in governance and political cultures, do they perpetuate lower income states' inability to catch up with higher income states?
That's
I will
it.
leave
I
to
think
you,
you
I
can-
think, the last one,
last
the
one.
final one. But anyway,
Yeah.
let me try my best on this. So the first is transfers, I think, again, one of the key things to measure is the outcomes of these expenditures. Only then can we figure out whether these transfers are actually being used, utilized appropriately or not. What is the difference across states in the outcomes, in the quality of the education or in the level? If you're at 9th grade, then are you a second grade? You can read at the level of second grade or whatever. So I think that will enable us to get a better sense of whether these resources are being utilized or not. And it's not only education; it could be other parts as well. So I think we need statistics. I think that's very key to try and move further along those lines. And I don't know what the Finance Commission can do on that, but I think there needs to be an emphasis to move towards more measurement of outcomes rather than simple per capita income or the income differences that Janak talked about.
I'll
Yeah,
come to
no,
this.
please
Yeah,
go ahead. Yeah.
No, you see this insofar as transfer from the center to states are concerned, it is a state's right. So there is a vertical imbalance in the fiscal imbalance in the country, whereby central government has a fewer the expenditure responsibility, but greater revenue raising ability, whereas states have greater expenditure responsibility and lower revenue raising ability. So it's their right, and that's why there is statutory body, which is the Finance Commission, which decides what the divisible pool, how much it should be divided. But the recent issue which has come up, which I thought they could have been mentioned in the paper also, about cesses and surcharges.
Yeah.
So these are not divided among the states. So if you see latest year data, it has come down, but it had gone up quite. If we worked out some time back, it was some 22% of the total revenue receipts of the central government, which is huge and which are not being shared with the states. So since there is vertical imbalance, so those resources have to go to states, and it's their right, I would say. But how those resources are, again divided among the states, which is when they are basically to be correct for horizontal inequalities. There the role of where the resources are being used properly, that come. As I mentioned earlier, 45% weight in the formula which Finance Commission uses is for distance from income. And states like Tamil Nadu, as I mentioned earlier, they are basically complaining. If we have been doing this for a long time, but we need to also assess whether it has led to
I think this is for the
this
mic,
thing,
right?
improved progress or not. That's a separate, but there the role of measurement comes. But in sort of vertical transfers are concerned, I would say it's the state's right, basically.
Yeah, it is. And but this is a very difficult question. But I think these outcomes are very important. But end of the day, you have chosen to be one country, right? And then there are other issues of transfer of credit from poorer states to richer states or whatever. So if Tamil Nadu is saying we need more revenue, but they also get migrant laborers and so on. So I think there are broader issues to be considered, and hopefully the Finance Commission looks at things a little differently. And again, it's a question of vertical. One of the things, and this is a fiscal challenge. One of the things is that after distributing the revenue, the center. Almost 40% of what they're spending is on interest costs. 40% of the revenue they're left with is interest costs. And then you have subsidies. So really the central government has nothing left with it, right? And the state governments, on the other hand, as you said, revenue deficit is a challenge. So, and then this goes back to exactly what Janak said. The fiscal deficit becomes large, it has spillover effects. It's going to impact your balance of payments. It's going to affect your rupee, which then in turn affects your subsidies. It's already affecting the monetary management because of the foreign exchange reserves being sold down, because its liquidity is getting constrained. If the government is not able to spend, which has been the large driver, if growth slows down to 4 or 5%, which was pre-COVID, then you have multiple challenges. So the entire macro stability will therefore become a question mark. On the politics, I will leave that out. I won't buy that because if small states do get a good political regime, they can do things which would be positive. So I would not lose hope on that. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rajan, and thank you all for attending. Let's have a round of applause before we bring it to a closer.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks all.